Good morning and welcome to all the attendees at this Japan Society's weekly webinar. My name is Bill Emmott and I have the honor and pleasure of being chairman of the Japan Society. As the attendees are gradually being admitted to this webinar in the slightly slow way that Zoom tends to work, let me once of the support during these strange and difficult times for all of us and for all your companies, and for your regular attendance at many of these webinars and at the Society's cultural events. Now, we in the Japan Society of the UK are rightly proud of the fact that our foundation on 9th of September 1891 makes us the oldest society in any Western country that is dedicated to fostering close relations with Japan and a close understanding of Japan. And prouder still that in 1892, Emperor Meiji himself sent us a gift of 100 guineas, providing his personal endorsement of our mission and conveying his hope for our, quotes, continued prosperity. Even if we have lacked a David Rockefeller to give us land and a building like our prosperous counterpart in New York, we do have antiquity on our side. And in that context, we in the UK can also point to the Anglo-Japanese alliance that lasted from 1902 until 1921. Today, we often talk about our shared values and the close relationship between our two countries. But what does this, what can this really mean? To each of us, we know that we are, to paraphrase Neville Chamberlain, faraway countries, but thanks to those close ties, we do certainly know rather more than little about each other, unlike poor Czechoslovakia in Chamberlain's time. In today's world, the dispersion of economic, political, military, technological, and cultural power to more and more countries, including the new superpower of China, certainly makes diplomatic, commercial, and scientific relationships more complicated, but also surely more vital, especially at a time when both our countries' traditional anchor relationship, that with the United States, has been looking somewhat less reliable and secure than at any time in the post-war era. So what do Britain and Japan mean for each other? What value does each hold in the other's collective mind? And what can and should we do together? That is the topic for today's webinar, and we have two perfect speakers to address and explore it. In Tokyo, as you have seen, I welcome Tomohiko Taniguchi, a man well known to the Japan Society over many years, notably because of his recent role as special advisor to Prime Minister Abe, but also back in the late 1990s to his time as London correspondent for Nikkei Business, and then his work as Deputy Director General for Public Diplomacy at the Foreign Ministry in 2005 to 2008. When he is not advising the Prime Minister or writing speeches, Tomohiko is also now a professor at Keio University's Graduate School of System Design and Management. And in London, I welcome another familiar face to us all, Jeremy Hunt MP, who as Foreign Secretary in 2018 to 19 made some notably successful visits to Japan, thanks especially to the 2 years he had spent in Japan as a young man, teaching English and learning Japanese. He is currently chair of the British-Japanese Parliamentary Group, as well as a long-time former health secretary, playing a key role, of course, assessing the government's coronavirus response. Both of our speakers will open with 10 minutes of remarks, following which, as usual, we will have a discussion and, most important of all, your questions. As before, please submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'm going to start in Tokyo with Tomohiko Taniguchi, who will explain what special value Britain bears for Japan. Over to you, Tomohiko. We've lost you're muted, Tomohiko. We need you to unmute.
Hello?
Hello, we've got you.
Thank you. It's very nice to meet you, Bill, and you, Mr. Hunt, and you all joining the webinar from the Tokyo end. I'm going to touch upon basically 3 points that are relevant for us to think about the future trajectory of the Anglo-Japan relationships. One is to do with the fact that Japan is sitting offshore in its relationship to the gigantic behemoth in the making. And this behemoth is going to be spending a crucial generation for the coming 30-year period. Because in 2049, China is going to celebrate the centenary of its founding. And in the interim period, China is going to do its utmost to bring about the hierarchical structure at the center of which is this Middle Kingdom. In order for Japan to maintain a safe distance, may I say, from China, it needs broader and yet broader strategic space. And that strategic space must be open, transparent, rules-based. Who else could be a better partner in that connection for Japan to work with? And that's Britain. And under the leadership of people like Jeremy Hunt, Anglo-Japan relationship has come to a new stage where not just business relations, not just cultural ties, not only people-to-people relationships, but also, importantly, military-to-military relationships have come to fruition, more so than ever before. And down the road, Japan is going to need even more such engagement of its trusted partner of the United Kingdom in the region and beyond. That's my point number one. Number two is also to do with a geopolitical concern. That's about the future course of the United States. Britain and Japan are bound by the lack of luxury where we could talk about what would happen to the United States. We oftentimes discuss what if the United States becomes such and such, what if the United States retreats from the center stage of the world. Britain and Japan, I think, are responsible for nothing of that nature to happen. Japan, with its long relationships with the United States, and Japan being the most important place for the United States to forward deploy its forces, Japan is capable, and indeed Japan must encourage, incentivize, motivate the future US presidents, whoever that may be, to stay engaged in the region and beyond. And it is crucial for the US-Japan relationship to scale up even further, for the United States to be involved in the region and again, beyond. My third point is also about the future, which is about economy. Now and in the future, as many already have pointed out, data is going to be the oil for our century and the next. And Britain, apart from Europe, and Japan, similarly developed politically, economically, and in terms of industry, must work together to improve data governance infrastructure to be shared by the wider community in the world. Europe may have its own agendas. The United States finds it very much important to help improve, help provide better frameworks for mega IT giants, GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. But Japan's got no such big entities, and Britain and Japan should find more similarities, not less, in providing clearly rules-based and transparent governance structure for the data-driven economy. I should stop here. I've spoken for 6 minutes, but I'll just stop here and ask Bill to follow up.
Thank you very much for that. A very clear agenda, especially China and the centrality of China in all our futures and managing our relationship with it. The centrality of the US has been part of our pasts, but of course is also part of our futures, and how we manage that. And data as the oil for the 21st century, I think, is a very fundamental concept. But it's actually hard to get one's grip on what it exactly means, and I think we will pursue that further. And now I'm going to ask Jeremy Hunt to respond, but also give the corresponding British view, or the view of a former British Foreign Secretary who's thought a lot about this issue. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Bill, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this Japan Society event. And it's a pleasure because my links with Japan go back many, many years. And when I think about the things that I most respect in Japanese culture, it gives me a chance to dust down my rather rusty Japanese. And I think the three qualities that I really took away from the 2 years I spent in Japan, which I came away admiring, were, first of all, the diligence with which Japanese people approach everything they do. You have this word in Japanese, majime, which we don't really have an equivalent for in English, but it sums up, it's a great compliment to say that someone is a majime person, and it means conscientious or diligent, and you hear it a lot more than you would in England. I also think Japanese have a tremendous sense of humility and a willingness to always recognize there are things that they can learn, and a desire to perfect things. And the word there that I always used to hear was kampeki shugi, the desire to be a perfectionist. And the final quality, which I greatly admired, even though this is something that British people are admired for as well, but I think you take the biscuit, is courtesy and consideration for others. And that phrase, omoyari, comes to mind. And I think that it's worth thinking about those values we have in common, because we have been through the massive challenge of the pandemic. And in the UK, that has hit us harder than it's hit you in Japan. I think Japan, you've done a better job than we have in dealing with coronavirus. And it's actually been pretty impressive, even though I think your government's getting as much flack as our government is getting for it. But it's obscured some huge geopolitical changes. First of all, in the global balance of power, which Dr. Taniguchi was talking about, but also in Britain's position in the world because of Brexit. And I agree wholeheartedly that this is a time to really think hard about the potential of Britain's relationship with Japan, because what I discovered as Foreign Secretary is that the strongest alliances in the world are not the transactional ones, but the ones based on shared values. So you can look at the relationship between Iran and Russia and China, and they are often allies in international fora, but it's a very transactional relationship. You then look at the relationship between Britain, Japan, and the United States, and there's a sort of starting point that we're going to take the same approach to the difficult issues that come along. And those relationships based on shared values tend to be stronger. What I would say is that we have great foundations, but we're not making the most of the potential. The foundations are economic. I know on this call is a friend of mine called Yumi Yamamoto, whose father was a wonderful man who helped set up the NSK factory in Peterlee in the north of England in the 1970s, one of the very first bits of direct inward investment from Japan to the UK, a factory that's still growing. And those economic links have been very important for the UK. I would go as far as to say that Japan gave Britain back its automotive industry, which was basically finished in the 1970s, early 80s, and the Japanese investment from Japanese car giants actually turned us into an automotive power center in Europe. But those trading links are very, very important and been very powerful for us. We have tremendous people-to-people links. The Japanese students in British universities, the British students like myself who went to Japan to learn Japanese, and those links I think are really strong. And then of course we have those shared democratic values. So where is the potential? Well, I think there are really three things, and two of them very much echo what Dr. Taniguchi said. The first is that I think we have a shared responsibility, Britain and Japan, to anchor the United States into the world's family of democracies. There has been for many, many years an isolationist streak in American politics. We shouldn't kid ourselves that this is just about President Trump, although I think it's very significant that John Bolton in his book says that the two world leaders who got equal top marks for being able to deal with Donald Trump were Prime Minister Abe and Boris Johnson. And we are probably one of only three countries, I would probably add Israel to that list, that can go into the White House and not be treated as a properly foreign country, but be treated as a friend. And that's a tremendously important position to hold when you have people like President Trump who openly toy with things like leaving NATO, the decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization, the lack of commitment to the United Nations. And these are very big decisions that could go seriously wrong. And I think we have a very important role to play in that. Secondly, as champions of free trade, because we have seen that big powers like China and America are very happy to carve up trade deals between themselves without understanding the vital importance of a global trading system. And I think the WTO is in urgent need of reform. And Britain and Japan are both countries with a long-standing commitment to free trade. And that has been the real engine of prosperity since the Second World War, led to the most extraordinary reductions in poverty around the world, and actually indirectly to the reduction in wars, because it is just so much harder to go to war with countries that you trade with. Not impossible, but much, much harder. So I think we both got to work together. And then I think the third area is around China. And I think Britain and Japan need to anchor in not just the United States, but our friends like Canada, Australia, in the EU, to develop a coordinated response to the rise of China. Not to stop the rise of China. It's an extraordinary achievement that China has lifted so many people out of poverty. And we should welcome their success in doing that, but to do all we can working together to try and shape that rise so that China coexists peacefully with us in a global system with international norms, international rules that we all respect. And I think there are some very big challenges that we will only overcome if we work together. The first is a decision which I don't think has been wholly made by China, although sometimes I worry it has, which is whether their objective in China is actually to become global superpower in a way that America was the global superpower in the second half of the last century, or whether they actually simply wish to coexist alongside Western countries as a major player, but not necessarily the hegemon. And if they want to be absolutely dominant, then that is going to be very worrying for people who believe strongly in democratic values, because they don't share those democratic values. And I think we're going to see this. We've seen the big shock that we've had in Hong Kong in the last few weeks. But we should also remember that by 2049, China has pledged that it must have completed reunification with Taiwan, and that they are willing to use force if they are not able to achieve that peacefully. And there is no willingness in Taiwan to effect that reunification peacefully. And after what's happened in Hong Kong, there is unlikely to be any willingness to do that. And so heading off a global catastrophe in Taiwan is something that Britain and Japan have a common interest in thinking about. And then the final comment I wanted to make is that I think in the last couple of years, there has been a cloud in Anglo-Japanese relations caused by Brexit, because Japan, quite understandably, has worried about the health of the investments it's made in the UK, many of which were made on the basis of access to the European single market. And I just wanted to say that, first of all, I don't have any doubt at all that we will have frictionless trade with the EU. I think it may take us a bit of time to get there, but it is so overwhelmingly in the interest of the EU that I think we will get there. Whether we get there this year or in 2, 3, 4 years' time, I don't know, but I think we will get there. But secondly, I'm someone who voted to remain, but in a democracy, believe that it was absolutely essential that the British government implemented that decision and makes a success of it. And as we do leave the EU, I think this will give Britain a freer hand to act in international circles in a way that will be very helpful and positive to Japan in dealing with some of the issues that Dr. Taniguchi discussed. And so, in a way, Britain is starting again in terms of international relations. And I think the absolutely essential role of Britain in the world is to try and help bind together the democracies of the world in our shared values, because if we don't defend them, they will come under threat. Bill, that's where I'm going to leave it.
Marvelous. Thank you very much, Jeremy. There's lots of things to explore further in both of those excellent sets of remarks. Clearly, we need to talk about China, and I think we'll move swiftly on to that. But also, I think an aspect of what Taniguchi-san mentioned, which is the military-to-military relationship that we have. That has been developing quite substantially over the last number of years, including during the time when you, Jeremy, were Foreign Secretary. Maybe I'll start with both of you to ask, where can that military relationship go, given the constraints on both of our countries' defense budgets and obviously pre-existing other relationships? A former Japanese ambassador on a previous webinar finished with a slightly throwaway remark that he would love to return to the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902. Is there a case for formalizing the military-to-military relationship that we have? Maybe I'll start with you, Tomohiko, because you raised this in a very positive way, but then I'd love to hear Jeremy's view on that.
Thank you. Compared to the situation we had 10 years ago, Britain and Japan have both made a substantial leap in that aspect. In the future, where the Indo-Pacific stage would be rather congested, if you like. The flag bearers, torch bearers, committed in safeguarding some of the basic principles, rules of law, democracy, open air, open waters, must work together. And I should very much like to reiterate what we have just heard from Mr. Hunt. That is that it is incumbent upon countries such as the UK and Japan to invite other like-minded maritime democracies, notably Australia, and more down the road, India, to do the same task. More concretely, I am very much encouraged at the prospect that soon in the future, Royal Navy is going to dispatch one of the newly commissioned aircraft carriers as part of its maiden voyage to this part of the world, Australia and Japan. It's going to be very much important, not necessarily militarily, you may say, but important in the sense that it would give us a clear signal to the countries and the region in the Indo-Pacific area that here, British Royal Navy is very much concerned about the rules that are in the making in that part of the world. Military to military exercises that have gained steam and momentum also for the last 6-7 years must proceed and must scale up. And it's the Japanese turn indeed that should send ground forces to the United Kingdom for the joint exercise. Again, it is to build trust. It is to show to the rest of the world that there is a partner-to-partner relationship that have similar goals and similar outlook. And also it's going to serve also for the purpose of anchoring, if I may borrow Mr. Hunt's term, the United States to the world center stage. Finally, my point should include technological and intelligence cooperation. Finally, in Tokyo, you see an intelligence community. When Japan lacked the secrecy bill, as Henry Kissinger in the early 1970s noted, Japan's government was amongst the leakiest governments of the world. And it's not the case anymore. Finally, you've got a community that could speak with the intelligence communities in the world, the UK, the United States, sometimes Israel. But I know that we would benefit more by cooperating with the British intelligence community than with most other intelligence communities in the world. Technology cooperation, that's still in the very much fledgling stage. Britain and Japan have discussed a prospect of developing missile technologies together. And those areas are the areas that we should explore more fully down the road. That'll be it at the moment.
Thank you, Jeremy. How do you see the potential here, and what can we do in defense and intelligence, as very much Taniguchi-san has said?
Well, I very much agree with those comments, and I would say that the two obvious areas that we could do more in are on freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific area, but particularly the South China Sea, where it's very clear that China will exact big individual punishment on any nations that act on their own, apart from the United States. But if we work together with Australia, France, Japan, the UK, and the USA, we can make sure we protect freedom of navigation. But also on intelligence, where I think it would be a very good medium-term aim to consider whether Japan could join the Five Eyes alliance, which the UK is part of with the United States, which is the most effective intelligence sharing partnership that exists. And I would welcome those two. And the reason I would welcome it is precisely for the reason that Dr. Taniguchi said, which is that we need to demonstrate to the United States that we aren't just looking to them to shoulder the whole business of being the world's policeman, that we are prepared to play our part. And at the moment, the United States taxpayers are funding around 40% of the cost of defending Europe. And that is just not fair. And European nations have got to recognize that maybe President Trump is more colorful in his language when he criticizes that, but that is a running sore, and will be a running sore with whoever the next president is, if it's not President Trump as well. And so if we want to anchor the United States into a global alliance of democracies, we've got to show that we're prepared to play our part. And that's why I think what medium-sized countries like Britain and Japan do is incredibly important.
Is it, I absolutely take your point, Jeremy, that European countries should spend more on defense. The other fact is that, Japan, of course, is constrained by its constitution from spending, as it were, NATO-like targets on defense. We are all somewhere between 1% and 2%. We have found in the past that it's more about technical capability that makes it dependent on the United States than sheer spending. What can we do technically? When we did our joint action in Libya with France, we needed American technology to be able to assist us. Is there something that actually we can do to make ourselves more capable alone, regardless of raw spending?
Well, Bill, money talks. And, in the end, it is pretty annoying for American administrations that they spend 4% of their GDP on defense. And the best in Europe is us. We spend 2%. Germany, it's 1.3%. And, I think the Americans understand why Japan is spending 1%. It may even be the Americans who put that into the constitution, I'm not sure. Yeah. But ultimately, I think that's going to have to change. Now, I understand the incredible sensitivity about that in the Japanese domestic political context. But I think we're all going to have to recognize that, that we need to be fair to the United States if we want the United States to continue to exercise a leadership role going forward. And in terms of how we spend it, I think it's important that it's not just the traditional ships and soldiers. There's what we do in cyber, what we do in space, and what we do in the Arctic. That are three very big new areas which we need to think about going forward.
Now, on this issue, Simon Shelton, who's spent a career in the defense industry, has asked a question which I shall include at this point. Building on the question of defense partnership, does the emerging free trade agreement between the UK and Japan offer an opportunity to strengthen cooperation in defense equipment development, particularly through cross-investment? Now, I'm not qualified to know whether there are particular barriers that can or cannot be removed, but is this something that either of you thinks should be, can be made specific in the UK-Japan Free Trade Agreement, which is currently under negotiation? Jeremy, what do you have a think about that first, and then we might move?
Well, I would hope that we could remove any barriers that exist to trade between the two countries, so I'm too not an expert in defence procurement, but I just make a general point about that agreement. As you will know, Bill, from writing about these things over many years, free trade agreements are agreements which countries, even countries that are the greatest of friends, traditionally play really hard ball, and they take a very long time as everyone tries to exact the smallest concession. I hope that doesn't happen with the discussions we're having with Japan now. We basically got a pretty good basis for an FTA, which is the one that we signed up to with the EU. Hopefully we can improve it in a few areas, but I just don't think we should get bogged down in trying to do something completely new, because I think both of us have got better things to be getting on with. And it would be a real mistake if two countries that are the greatest of friends spend 5 years negotiating an FTA post-Brexit, when actually with a fair wind we could do it by Christmas.
Certainly there's a tremendous amount of goodwill between the two countries on all of these issues. I'm sure that's right. Taniguchi-san, Tomohiko, what's your thought about this area of both the defense cooperation as seen in the FTA, but also this question about fair shares of defense spending vis-a-vis the United States? Perhaps it's most expressed in Northeast Asia through the issue of payments for bases rather than raw defense. And we were hearing last week, talking about the Korean Peninsula, obviously the specific dispute underway now between South Korea, between ROK and the United States. How does that feel to you in Tokyo?
Right. If one looks back at the past, Japan made a huge stride in the 1950s and 60s, during which the surrounding region for Japan was far from peaceful. First, in the Korean Peninsula, the Allied forces fought against North Korea, Russia, British officers and soldiers, which not many people in Japan, I'm afraid, are aware. And in Vietnam, again, the Americans, but also Australians and others, were engaged when Japan was single-mindedly focused on rebuilding its economy. First and foremost, I would like more people in Japan to be aware of that kind of historical debt that Japan as a nation and people in Japan as a people have owed to the commitment and engagement done by the US and others, including the UK. And I understand the frustrations held rather widely by the Washington policy forming circle that it's not a fair deal between Japan and the United States because the Japanese are not supposed to shed any blood, sweat, and tears if things go on as they have. And Japanese constitution actually stipulates nothing about the money to be spent on its own defense purposes. And Prime Minister Abe has been of a view that Japan must spend more on its own defense. And by spending more, primarily Japan must show to its own people and to the rest of the rest of the world that Japan is determined to help safeguard some of the important territorial integrity, but also basic principles. So that's about more, let's say, responsibility to be borne by the Japanese. The second, Simon Shelton's question, I don't think has got much relevance to the free trade agreement or the economic partnership agreement. And on that point, I would like to very much agree with Jeremy, if I may go on the first term basis. Jeremy's point that given the fact that Japan has forged the wide-ranging economic partnership agreement with the EU already, and then with some of the big agricultural exporters like Australia, Canada, the United States, although the United States has chosen to withdraw from the pact, I mean TPP, it's going to be far easier than it was 10, 20 years ago to forge a similar one between the UK and Japan. And indeed, there is very much a strong interest in bringing Japan and the UK closer together under the same roof of the TPP or CPTPP. But having said all that, I personally have been very much frustrated by the slow tempo with which Britain-Japan defense technology cooperation has proceeded or has not proceeded. And I would like more steam to be put into this cooperation. How is the question that we should ponder, and I don't know exactly how we should push this process forward, but there must be many areas where Britain and Japan could cooperate. Cyber, outer space, the areas that Jeremy just mentioned are some of the most prosperous areas that there must be a greater synergy between the UK and Japan, but among the United States, the UK, and Japan. That's it at the moment.
Now, thank you. There's perhaps before we move on to other subjects, there's a specific question about the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which perhaps I might refer to Jeremy for. Yuichiro Nakajima has asked, might the UK recommend to other members of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance that Japan be added as a member? And he has added the writer that he's aware that Japan does have a collaborative relationship with Five Eyes. What are the sort of politics and the technical issues surrounding this area of intelligence cooperation that we should understand? Jeremy.
Well, I think I was expressing my view, which is that I think we have that trust between Japan and the other members of the Five Eyes group that is the starting point on this. And I think that Tomohiko is actually right to say that perhaps one of the reasons why there has been hesitation on this front is in the past there have been concerns about the security of information held with Japan, but I absolutely agree that has fundamentally changed. So I think this is something that is an extremely sensitive area, and the difficulty, I don't want to pretend this is an easy thing. The difficulty is that this is actually an incredibly successful intelligence sharing alliance. And so there's an understandable nervousness about changing anything, because sharing intelligence is like the most difficult thing you can possibly share, because it's just so sensitive and lives are at stake if things go wrong. But I personally think that we should look at that as an objective.
Yeah, well, interesting. That would be pretty interesting to do. Now, I suppose here's a different question. So to slightly move off and back to the shared values question. I mean, one question for both of you is, how do we deal with, and how important it is that actually we don't share all values because we're different? And actually an anonymous attendee has asked a question about where we have different views on, for example, female empowerment in Japanese society, which, although the formal view of Prime Minister Abe is very much in favor of it, the practice is far behind, which is why he's pushed. But we have other differences of values, such as about the death penalty. How do we need forums to basically discuss our values, or do we have just a set of different values, some of which matter and some of which don't? That would be another way of putting it. Jeremy, should we start with you and then perhaps move to Tomohiko?
Well, look, I don't think you should hide these things, particularly between friends. I think the death penalty is a fairly marginal issue. It's such an unusual thing, and it's yes, there's a different approach there. I don't think there's any difference at all on female empowerment. Japan is truthfully probably a little bit behind us, but we've got a lot of work to do in the UK, and a lot of glass ceilings that we still need to break open. I would say that there are probably differences when it comes to the two biggest areas where there are probably differences is on immigration, where I think most people in the UK think it's an extremely positive thing for society to integrate people from different countries, and I think there's a lot more caution about that in Japan. And I think that there are aspects of the Japanese justice system which sometimes give us concern. But the truth is that I'm sure that Tomohiko could find many things to criticize about British society as well. Maybe I should invite him to answer that difficult question before I get myself into any deeper waters.
Go ahead, Tomohiko.
Well, certainly I've got many complaints ranging from water pressure in average British houses to the sensitivity with which people in Japan, cabbies, indeed exhibit in catching regional accents. I've been told on many occasions by the taxi drivers whether I was from the western coast of the United States. I was speaking with a heavy American accent at the time, and I couldn't pronounce the name of the bridge that connected between the City of London and then Financial Times headquarters. But anyhow, the difference between the two nations is paramount in their own languages. The Japanese language is not a universally spoken language, it's just a local language. And the fact that English is still being even more widely used by the international community has been and will continue to be the most cherished, I think, value that people in the UK and UK as a nation should find. And on that point, Japan puts very much high esteem, because as a platform, it is the widest and the most open. And as such, it could include a whole sort of different intelligence, information, knowledge from across the world, which is the reason why I would say the stress should continue to be put on London, not on Paris, not on Berlin in that regard. Yes, so that's the biggest difference that divides the two nations. But seen from the opposite angle, I think the fact that the British people speak the international language is something that should be cherished now and down the road.
Thank you. Now, I mean, a question that brings us back to China, but in a perhaps in a more specific way. Matthew Grayson has asked that he says he thinks Japan and the UK respectively take somewhat different styles and approaches in our dealings with China. What can the UK learn from Japan in this regard? And I'll just add to that while of course policy towards China has long been a matter of great debate and importance for obvious reasons in the LDP, it's very recently become a very highly political issue inside the Conservative Party, in particular in the UK, obviously as the ruling party, and there's been a big pressure to take a tougher line on China inside British politics. What do you think, Tomohiko, we can learn from your approach and your political approach towards China? And then we can come back to how we can collaborate. And of course, Huawei has been a big part of our focus and technology in the debate, as well as obviously Hong Kong most recently.
Picking up your last point, Bill, Huawei, as far as I understand, has shown its long-term commitment dating back to the 1990s in building R&D facilities, recruiting cream of the crop students from top universities in the UK. Huawei has done nothing of that sort in Japan. And that reminds me of the number of Confucius schools one finds in Japan in comparison to the number of the same education institution one finds in the UK. The number you have in the UK is far greater than the one you find in Japan. That all tells us that China has been very much strategically minded in cementing and enriching its ties with important nations, such as the United States and the United Kingdom. And as I mentioned, the countries that speak the international language therefore set the tone for the international discussions and debate. Huawei has failed in selling its telecom infrastructure equipment to Japan, and Japan virtually has set a policy that when it comes to building 5th generation information telephony network, it's got to provide trusted materials. So that's about Huawei. But I think it's very much difficult for one to compare what Japan's relationship is like with China with what the UK's relationship should be like with China, simply because Japan is way too close to China. And secondly, because there's been an influx of Chinese people, and more so down the road in Japan, due to the similar geographic proximity. Third is to do with this massive amount of investment already done by Japanese industrialists, big, medium-sized, small, in China. All combined, it all tells the Japanese that little could be achieved by Japan standing alone in the face of this gigantic neighbor. Which brings me back to the first point that I raised, that in the future, for Japan to have a safe distance, to maintain its independence, both politically, militarily, and importantly, psychologically, from China, Japan needs more partners and more like-minded shared value partners down the road. And so it should reinforce the value that Japan should put on its relationship with the UK.
Jeremy, would you like to follow up on that briefly? I shouldn't hog the whole subject, the rest of the time on China, but nevertheless, it's a very important issue.
Yes, I mean, I agree with what Tomohiko has said. I don't think the approach that's the UK and Japan have taken has been very different. I think that both countries recognize China's power as China's importance as a market, and we both have a lot of commercial interests. And we both have a very similar approach, which is that, we need to recognize the risks in China's growth if China goes in the wrong direction. But we want to try and avoid a new Cold War. And that the reality is that if we treat China like we treated the Soviet Union, we risk failing, because in the end, the Cold War was won because we bankrupted the Soviet Union, because we had a capitalist system that was immensely wealthier, and we were able to outspend the Soviet Union. And that was the fundamental reason why Gorbachev gave up when he did. And that is not going to happen with China. So we need to find a way of living with China that protects our democratic systems and our values and an international rules-based order. And that is going to need some very strategic long-term thinking, which I think Japan is very good at. But I have to say that from my time as Foreign Secretary, I don't think that there is nearly enough strategic thinking going on between like-minded Western nations about the positive way that we can integrate China's rise into the global order. And this is something that urgently needs to happen.
Well said. No, I think, really, one bee in my bonnet has always been that to deal with China, or to think about international relations, we have to think of ourselves as networks, not as individual countries. We are the greatest network, at least in history, of the West, but we spend too little time talking to each other strategically about what that means and how then to integrate, as you say, people into the system, and to preserve that network, which is a vitally important thing, which is what you're both talking about our relationship with the United States, especially. Now I'm going to change the topic slightly for the last few moments, because one question's come in that says about the future. Well, we've been talking about the future, but Cheryl Roberts has asked, as an educator, the future of our relationship is very important. What should we do further in schools to help UK-Japanese relations, please? I'm trying to bring Japanese culture into my classroom and school in Yorkshire as much as I can. We must start with young people. Well, specifically, obviously, about schools, but also about how do we reach, and what can we do to reach people who are, shall we say, younger than the three of us, who are, shall we say, not entirely of the future generation. Perhaps in Jeremy's case, we should say that he is, but Tomohiko and I think, are a similar age. What can we do in schools? Let's start with you, Jeremy, since you spent some time in Japanese schools.
Well, I think, it's really interesting. When I lived in Japan in 1990, 1991, and made many Japanese friends. And what seems to me interesting is how the youth culture in Britain and Japan has actually come together in that period. And I don't think there are very large differences in outlook between young Japanese people and young British people. But we need to do everything we can to encourage those links. And I think there are, great examples of how that happens with things like the JET program. But we need to, always be mindful of the importance of that, because as Tomohiko said, we speak different languages, and that always creates a potential barrier. And so I think, all I'd really want to say is that, I am a product of those links between young people in Britain and young people in Japan in their 20s, and it stayed with me for the rest of my life. So I think we should just recognize that the young people today are going to be the politicians and leaders of the future, and so we need to lay those foundations.
Absolutely. Tomohiko, can we double and treble our investment in this kind of program of building connections, and as you say, a psychological connection across the generations?
Right. Although there must be much to be done in the future, compared to the relationships Japan has with other, for instance, European nations, the UK is second to none in that regard. And I would like to say and see that in the future, more and more young people leaving Japan and setting foot on the British soil to further their education. Not only education provided in places such as Oxford and Cambridge, but also in professional schools and music schools and so on and so forth. The situation that you have seen in Japan has been rather distinct because since 1990, when the speculative financial bubble burst, which Bill covered very much intensively, until very recently, Japan showed no growth, and people between the age of 20 something and 50 something are the people that have undergone no growth period whatsoever in Japan's history. So it's been a unique generation of whom self-esteem, self-efficacy, may I say, have had to be rather small in size and ambition compared to other generations. But finally, we were just about to celebrate, prior to this pandemic, that people in the 20s in Japan have become finally more forthcoming, and more people, more of that generation have become interested in going abroad to study. So the first priority must be to bring Japan's economy back to where it was 6 months ago. And then I would like to see more 20-something teenagers going to the UK. And I think the United Kingdom remains one of the topmost destinations for the Japanese.
Well, I think that many of our members would absolutely echo that hope. And I think it's a marvelous point to finish this fascinating and very rich discussion on. I should mention, as perhaps I should have done even in my introduction, that we in the UK were very flattered that Emperor Naruhito chose the UK as his first planned destination for a state visit very unfortunately that had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And he, of course, is someone who came to the UK as a young man, studied in his case in Oxford, and has taken back with him through the rest of his life a strong relationship between our two countries. So we are hoping very much that that state visit can be rescheduled for post-pandemic, but also that people of that age and beyond, as you say, do come in every possible way to build that relationship between us. But I also hope that between politicians and political advisors, we can build further relations as we have done in this webinar. And I thank both you, Tomohiko Taniguchi, giving up part of the end of your evening in Tokyo so generously to us to share your very inspiring views about how we can relate together, and Jeremy Hunt in the UK also giving up your very busy time. Perhaps a relief for not talking all the time about health, but very much sharing your great experience as Foreign Secretary and as someone who went to Japan in your youth. So thank you to all. Thank you to all Japan Society members. Next week's webinar will be about the arts with two people from the Royal Academy in London and from the Mori Museum, the Mori Contemporary Art Museum in Tokyo, talking about arts institutions. Please come again, but thank you again, Tomohiko Taniguchi and Jeremy Hunt, and have a great day.